Hello, everyone. This is CD&I working group. Thanks for coming. Um, Looks like people are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome back to IETF. If you are not here for the CD&I working group, you might be in the wrong room. Otherwise, we will move ahead. This is the note well. Everyone should be familiar with it. All of your contributions and participations are governed by the rules set forth in these BCPs. If you haven't read them, you should. But otherwise, you should be aware that of the IPR rules of the IETF, and you agree to them by being here. Sanjay and I are here to conduct our CD9 meeting for IETF 112. If we could have a volunteer to just monitor the Jabber room, that would be awesome. If someone wants to volunteer for that, I would be taking minutes. If someone else also wants to take minutes, that would be great as well. Blue sheets are taken care of for us by Echo. So someone could just step up and say yes, they'll just take a peek in Jabber. Otherwise, Sanjay will have to do it. I don't think there's going to be a lot going on in the Jabber room, but someone can just take a peek. Thanks, Chris. Awesome. All right, then we will move on. These are the existing milestones for the working group. We're going to be talking about URI signing, which is in IESG, is with the IESG, and Phil has an update for us. We have two existing milestone items, GPS delegation, which Frederick's going to give an update on. I know there's been some discussion on the list. I'm happy to see that we're making some progress there. And then Mira is going to talk about the triggers interface. Here is our agenda. We got 2 hours this time because we did run out of time last time. So hopefully everyone will have plenty of opportunity to ask questions and discuss. But we do have a packed agenda. So if anyone has any changes they'd like to make or voice, please do so now. Otherwise, we will move on. No? Okay. Then the first thing on the agenda is we had a call for adoption on 2 drafts that have been out after the last IETF. We just wanted to go over that. Here they are. The first one is the CD&I triggers extension draft. Just as a recap, there was originally a draft done by Ori that we adopted back in IETF 103. We then made some decisions earlier this year to change it to be a full update of the existing draft, just because it seemed like it was easier to understand rather than as just a separate set of extensions. And so there were no objections on the list. There were some people who expressed, their approval of this, and so we are ready to move forward with adoption. We're just giving folks the last chance here to object. Otherwise, we will move forward with adoption draft. I don't see anyone stepping up to object, so I think this one's pretty straightforward. The existing milestone is set for December of this year. I don't know if that's still a reasonable deadline here. Do you think that we should extend that? I think maybe updating that milestone to, what is a reasonable time frame to get that finished up? Do you think we can get it done by IETF 113, or do you think it's pretty close as is?
I think that we should be able to get done with the merge by the IETF 113, but I also suggest further work on this draft, so this might take longer.
Okay. I'd like to set a deadline just because deadlines are good for us. It's good for us to have deadlines. I don't want us to rush to get it in by obviously next month, but I think, if we feel good about trying to shoot for March of 2022, I would be good with updating the milestone package,
Okay, let's start.
unless anyone has an objection. All right. And then the other draft was the footprint extension. Again, this is just additions to the metadata footprint registry. By design, we built a registry so that we could add stuff as we move forward and found things that we needed. And I think this is a great example of that. The changes are fairly straightforward. There were no objections on the list. And there was support for it on the list. If anyone has any objections to it, this is your last chance before we call the adoption. And I'd like to go ahead and just add a milestone for this. And I think this one's pretty straightforward. I think we should be able to get it done by the next IETF. Do you see any issues with that, setting a deadline of March for this as well?
For a last call, or
for trying to finish it up, yeah, and trying to get to a last call by next IETF.
okay.
I don't think there's a lot more to add to this one. This one's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think so. We should be able to have that, wrapped up by end of March. I mean, by the IETF 113.
Right. Or any last discussion topics we can talk about in March, and then push that out if we need to. But I encourage everyone to go. Please read these drafts, add any comments you have to the list, and we will try and wrap these up quickly. All right. So then I am going to load up Mir's slides so that he can go ahead and talk about these two drafts. And Mir, please take it away.
Thank you. So, as Kevin already explained in the in IETF 111, we proposed 2 assists for adoption. The first one is adding. Can you please? Okay. So I'll cover both of them and I'll give a quick recap and open it for questions. So the first draft is extending the footprint and capability interface with additional footprint types. Next, please. So a quick recap of the current state. Currently, RFC 8006 defines the footprint types, which can be IPv4, IPv6, ASN, and country code. Country code specifically is an ISO 3166 code, two alphanumeric characters. And it further describes the footprint object. As you can see in the example, a footprint object is built of a footprint type and footprint values. Okay, so in this example, the footprint type is IPv4, and the values are client matching this footprint object as belongs to one of the subnets in the list. Next, please. RFC 808, which is the FCI footprint capability interface, uses this footprint objects, and in order to specify which capability, the availability of capabilities for specific clients. So in this example, the specified capability is available for clients within the ASN 64496 that resides in the US. So the first footprint type we would like to add is practically a next step for the country code, taking it one level down geographically wise. So if ISO 316, if the country code relates to the United States or to country, the subdivision code relates to states in the US or province in Canada. So the ISO 31662 defines 3 alpha alpha characters subdivision codes, and we would like to use them in order to get a better granularity of the footprint objects. In the below examples, you can see a footprint object matching the state of New York within the US, as well as the state of New Jersey in the US. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. The next footprint type we would like to add is the footprint union. I discussed it in the previous IETF. The current semantic of the footprint and capability API says that the list of footprint objects is as a narrowing semantics, and we would like to have some additive semantics. For example, if we want in the part of the footprint definition marked in red, we try to define clients residing in the US or residing in Canada province of Nova Scotia. Okay, so it allows us to take two different footprint types and merge them into a large footprint object in additive way, not a narrowing way. I think this is all we added in this draft. There was only one change since the previous IETF summit meeting, which changes the footprint type name from 31162 code to subdivision code, following I think Alfonso remark. Any questions, concern, or something like that regarding those suggestions? Okay, so let's move on. The second draft was dealing with the CDNI control interface, second edition. Next, please. So as a reminder, the RFC 8007 defines the CDN control interface, which allows an upstream CDN to manage the content and metadata held by the downstream CDN. For example, preposition, invalidation, or purge. And as Kevin already mentioned, Ori and Sanjay worked on a draft that extends this RFC, and currently we want and we decided that it would make sense to merge all the extension into the original RFC and create a new RFC with a new coherent RFC, and which will allow us to also obsolete RFC 8007. There's currently in the draft, there is no new content beyond the content already approved by this working group. So what is there? What we would like to add? And next, please. The first added functionality is the ability to extend the trigger extensibility. Okay, currently the RFC 8007, the trigger object has a closed set of properties, and there is no way to define a fine control over the trigger execution, such as a time for the trigger to be executed or a specific location for trigger execution. And the draft suggests a new generic extensions mechanism for this trigger for the trigger. The trigger object, the version 2 of the trigger object can have a list of generic extensions similar to the generic metadata from the RFC 8006. And for example, for such a generic extension is the time extension, allowing the absence CDN to indicate that the content preposition should happen at 3 a.m. Buenos Aires time. Okay, I hope I'm not rushing it. So if there is any question regarding, it's good. Please stop me whenever you want. Okay, let's proceed. The second added functionality is the error propagation. In the case that we have multiple levels of CDN, so that a trigger from the upstream CDN propagates through the downstream CDN to a further downstream CDN. There are situations that a failure happens in the trigger, a failure in the trigger execution happens within the further downstream CDN, and the draft allows a mechanism. So there's a mechanism that allows the downstream CDN to indicate that the failure happened within the further downstream CDN if it desired to. It just add the CDN ID to the error object. Okay, next. And the last, and actually most simple addition to the RFC, to the draft, is the additional content selection methods. Okay, so the original RFC has a set of properties that allows the selection of metadata or content, URLs or patterns, and the draft suggests to the selection of content via regexes, as well as playlists, for example, HLS or Dash. Okay, and in order to support that, we need to extend both the trigger object, and so we have a version 2 of it, and the error object. Okay, so that's all for the adoption stage. So it would be a good point to stop and have questions or any.
So all of that is a review of what was already in there that was available in the existing one that we talked about last night.
Yeah, everything there was everything I mentioned so far. It was already available, discussed in the original draft that was adopted by this working group, and we just want to we just merge it into the original RFC.
Okay. Yeah, so folks should go and, if you haven't read it, read it. If you have comments, obviously comment. I think, Nir, though, you wanted to propose some additional stuff to add to it.
So following the adoption of the RFC, I would like to suggest an additional change. As I already said, when as you can see on the left side of the slide, the trigger object has a closed list of properties allowing the content or metadata selection, and we now added to a new content selection method, which is the content regexes and content playlists. And in order to do that, we must redefine the trigger object and create a version 2 of it, as well as the error object. And I think that it would be better to go to a generic mechanism, that a new method for selecting a new content for prepositioning, for example, would be done when we would like to define a new method for content selection. We just do it by registration, as we do now with the footprint object that we just registered. So I would like to suggest that the trigger v2 object will have actually a list, an objects list of generic trigger objects that can be any one of those of this option, metadata URLs or content URLs, etc. And we will maintain a registry for this content selection methods.
There was an email on the list about this, if I recall, and you and I had a discussion about this. I think it makes sense to me, but as an author of the metadata draft, and the use of generic metadata makes sense, and the use of a generic trigger object makes sense to me. I think it's cleaner than having to keep enumerating things as properties inside the trigger object. So I like the idea personally. I don't know if anyone else wants to step up to the mic and put out an opinion. I think it does make for a cleaner object. And do we have a draft with proposed changes for that out, or
not yet? I didn't want to make a noise with that before we have the adoption.
Okay. I think it's an interesting idea. I think I like the idea. If anyone else has thoughts on it, please speak up, or we can, I think, move forward with the adoption piece. So go ahead and push the updated drafts as working group drafts, and then we can push out an additional update with proposals and start discussing this additional change on top of that. Is that what you were thinking, Laura?
Yeah, I be happy to.
Okay. I think that's a good plan. I'll stop here again and pause to see if anybody else wants to voice an opinion. I think that means everyone agrees. Okay.
I didn't hear any objections here.
There are no objections. I think it's easier to discuss once we have some text in front of us. So I'm happy to let's put out the working group draft and then propose an update and discuss it on the list. Oh, I see there's a comment. Okay. Chris agrees. Excellent. All right. Thanks, Nir. Anything else? Are you good?
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Then next up we have Phil. Phil's going to give us his update on URI signing.
How's it going, everybody? All right, so quick rehash of some things that happened that we went over in the summer IETF session. It was in last call in February. I did post a new revision right before the draft dead period. Kevin already reviewed it, gave some feedback, as did Chris. Appreciate that. I've already merged those changes, except for one. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So back to the feedback that we got in the last call in February. I addressed all the easy things, but there were a couple things that I don't think were so easy. So client IP, there were usefulness and privacy concerns. Honestly, I think they were mostly usefulness. Like, how does this operate when you're dealing with dual stacked? How does this operate when you're dealing with MPTCP? How does this operate when you're dealing with switching from Wi-Fi to mobile? All the cases that we're aware of. It wasn't like any shockers were in there, but it was just they felt that either it wasn't talked about enough, or maybe its usefulness is so small that we should just remove it. Shared keys, that one was a really big one. I added some more text to say hey, this is a really bad idea. You really shouldn't do this, but if you want to, here's how you do it, and it's supported. There were some things that I changed from should to must because I had no good reason why it shouldn't be must. And then there's always been a nagging question of more advice for designated experts. I've put some stuff in there, but I really don't know what more to put. And if anybody has good examples of this, I'd love to have that. I am going to email all the ADs, especially the ones that talked about that, and ask for specific examples because I'm kind of out of ideas for that one. So I have a couple questions that I want to put forth. And I was thinking about this as the meeting was starting up that I probably should have done this on the mailing list first too, but I will follow up with that. Should we remove client IP? The reason why it was put in there was because it was traditionally in there in the proprietary implementations. So people wanted it, people used it. People like to be able to say, hey, here, let me give you a quick preview link. What's your IP? And people would know that it needed to be their cable modem IP, and if they changed anything, it would fail, that sort of thing. Like that was the use case. It wasn't really meant to be a robust option that would be used for the general case. But maybe it's just not useful and we should remove it rather than trying to write a bunch of text around why people shouldn't use it. Second question is removing shared keys. Do we want to stop? There's people in the queue I can answer if people want to comment about that first question.
Yeah, let's let Andrew go ahead.
I think, why don't you go ahead, Andrew?
To your point about the client IPs, there are a lot of caveats, a lot of risks. I mean, I've been personally bitten between clients switching on dual stack between V4, V6 with certain vendors, but unless there's a large overhead in keeping it in, I feel like keeping it in is probably the best bet. It's going to add flexibility and use cases where, like you mentioned, there could be very niche URI signing that folks are going to want to do, maybe even internally within organizations, so on and so forth. Unless there's a risk in keeping it, I think keeping it is probably the better way to go. With the understanding that you mentioned, there's caveats, and I think just a general disclaimer that there are caveats with how this works, and it's up to you to accept all those caveats if you implement this.
Okay, that's very helpful. So real quick before Kevin speaks, so I'm going to send these to the mailing list. It would be awesome, Andrew, if you could kind of reiterate that on the mailing list, because I want to use that to point the ADs to about their concerns, and I'll make sure that I make the text robust enough if it's not already. I already added some stuff to it, but I might want to just polish it up a little bit and really kind of drive home that point that these are, like you said, niche use cases that it's there to support.
Yeah, I'll throw in my 2 cents as an individual. I think that, we had always talked about the internal use private network kind of, I'm an ISP, I own it, I want to use an IP address for a specific purpose, and that's the only place it's really good for. I mean, URI signing has a lot of questionable security things in there, right? We all know that. We could certainly beef up the disclaimers about it. I saw that you added one. I mean, we can make it even more, obvious to folks how bad it is. But I think if there are people who need it, and that was the original rationale, right? There is a vendor who wanted this, and so I don't necessarily see a reason to pull it unless there's a lot of pushback. I don't know how bad the pushback was, but we could probably put bigger, bolder things in there about why you shouldn't use it, and also where the 1 or 2 good use cases are for using this, which helps the reader understand why we are keeping it in.
Okay. Chris?
I won't rehash all of that. I agree with the previous commenters. There's lots of desire for this. The one thing I wanted to add was there are there are some situations where you know the set of IP addresses that it could be coming in from, and the client IP field could actually be more useful if we made it into an array. I hesitate to suggest enhancements at this point, but it is a fairly simple one.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about that when I was going through this again. Like we could do a lot of things. We could probably add like a V4 and a V6 client IP and do some other stuff. I also agree with doing changes this late in the game, unless people really felt like, hey, I have a use case for that. I would kind of want to say maybe we should leave that to somebody who has a use case for it to write an extension in the future. But if there's a use case for it, like where you're like, hey, I would really like to do this specific thing, and I want to do it, it's not theoretical, I would consider changing it. But I again emphasize, I really don't want to if we don't have to.
There is actually a real use case around wanting to put in both an IPv4 and an IPv6. And there are some cases where both addresses will be known at the time the token is generated. And that can be reasonably reliably produced. Likewise, there are a couple of use cases around a token that can be used by a small collection of systems. And right now, you could put in a CIDR, which is kind of what we picture for that. I just think the simplest solution is to not overthink it and to turn it into an array. But again, it could go either way. I think this is a marginal feature to start with.
Okay.
I think that we have been in IETF last called for a very long time. If we were going to make those types of changes, this is something we would have to go and pull it and do a new round on. I'm all for it if somebody really needs it, right? If people are going to say this draft is not useful to me because I need this feature, then we should put in the feature. I'm with you, Phil. But if not, getting this thing done feels like the right thing.
Agreed. Okay.
Glenn had a comment as well in the chat. Disclaimer, and then a question about common access token. I'm not familiar with that project, first of all.
Okay, so comment on the client IP should stay with a big warning. That's fair. Coordinate URI signing specification, common access token project. I'm not familiar with that, so de facto no, but we could talk about it. I don't know. I don't really have a sense of what that looks like and what that might mean for delaying URI signing more. So I don't want to promise anything, but I was not aware of that before.
Yeah, I don't know if it's close. If it's close, it's something we could think about. If it's not close, then Glenn, I know you had AWS Signature 4 in your draft, and I've been thinking about that as well. It's not close enough for us to merge or do anything with, I don't think. But okay. You have another question.
Yes. So very similar to removing client IP is removing shared keys, and I kind of have the same feelings on it. That it was created to do niche tests and stuff like that. I did add some text about, hey, really don't do this. This is not a good architecture. There's a lot of problems with it, especially when you're dealing with tiered CDNs and stuff. But I kind of feel like we should keep it, but maybe it's just something where, there was a line drawn in the sand at the IETF saying, hey, we're not going to do things like this anymore at all, ever, no matter how valuable or useful they are, because they are bad. So before I went and argued it, I wanted to again ask, should we remove the shared key support?
So
Kevin?
I remember why we put in the shared keys, because at the time we started writing this, all of the implementation with public CDNs had shared keys. And so, right, it's a thing that we wanted to support because that's what everybody was doing. I don't know if that's still the case. I imagine it probably is still supported. And there are probably people who would like to have it because, you know, their legacy systems use it, but it's not a good idea. We could put, you know, big disclaimer text again, but
Put even bigger disclaimer text saying that it's even of more marginal value than the client IP. Please really don't use this unless you have no other option.
again, yeah. But there are going to be people who argue, I own the network and this is easy and we already do it today, so why should I have to change it? Then I can't use your spec. I don't want to leave those people out, but maybe we should force them to move forward. I'm okay with leaving it, but there's an argument there.
Yeah.
Chris?
I think that if you own the network and you don't have to interoperate with anybody, you don't need a standard to tell you how to interoperate with people.
Fair point.
So is what you're saying that we could remove explicit shared key support and then just say something like, if an operator internally wanted to do that themselves, that would be on them, but we're not giving examples or ways to do it in this document, that kind of thing, like something in security concerns?
I mean, you could you could reasonably just remove it entirely. We don't have a police force. We can't stop people from using shared keys. It's pretty obvious how you would use shared keys if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think maybe we could do something like that where we just remove it. I kind of still want to have like a sentence or two about it, maybe in the security concerns. Like, historically, people have used shared keys. This draft does not address using shared keys. Please consider not using shared keys if you were thinking about it, type of thing. Because I think it still needs to be addressed, but then we just remove all the examples and discussion about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably wise.
Okay.
I agree. We should state explicitly that we're not doing it, right?
Yep.
Because it was in previous versions, so be able to see it. They just look at history.
Okay, and the last question, this was only brought up by one AD, but he brought it up multiple times, and he said he really doesn't understand how this draft works if the CDNI URI container is not mandatory. And now my understanding of why we chose to do that is essentially, and this is going to probably be even more scary than shared keys, is if we wanted to give somebody a skeleton key, like here, this token works for anything or works for anything for a certain amount of time, like it doesn't matter what the URI is. But he makes a good point, like that seems, he made it in a way of, I don't understand how this would even work, but when I was thinking about the argument to it, and all the discussion on client IP and shared keys, I was like, yeah, skeleton key is probably kind of a sketchy argument, but is that something that people need? Does somebody need to just say, look, I don't want to keep getting a new updated token for my internal use case, much like client IP. Let's just leave it in there, but put something like you really, really should put something in here if you're giving it out to anybody outside of whatever, because, you know, or maybe something like you probably want to put client IP in here if you're not using URI container. I really don't want to get into like a matrix of you should have this if you don't this or this, you know, that kind of combination of claims in there. But maybe we should. I kind of feel maybe we should keep it with some more text saying, if you're not using this, you're leaving yourself open, so maybe you should have client IP or a very short expiry time or something else to compensate.
I'm having some mic issues. Is anybody also hearing some of the noise on the, there's some static I don't know if it's coming from there, Phil, or
I could switch headphones. I've been told I have complaints with these.
you came prepared. Can you hear us?
Does that make it any better?
Yes, a lot better.
Oh, sorry. Apologize to everybody then.
Oh, that's fine.
So, Chris, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so there is a use case with no CDNI UC. If your CDN is accepting keys from multiple issuers, you are likely to, in fact, you are going to have a limitation where you have an association between what systems you accept that key for, or that key. If you're willing to accept that an issuer can authorize a given URI in general, then you have to be willing to allow an issuer to authorize any URI. So there's no reason to, they can just put .splat in the CDNI UC, right? There's no reason to force them to put .splat in there if they can just eliminate it. It's just a waste of a regex compilation and execution.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with that. So, like I said before, I'm gonna send these all out in questions to the mailing list too, and if you can reply, because it'd be much easier to send them links to a mailing list than links to a video somewhere. And again, apologize for not doing that before this call. But yeah, okay. And if there's no more comments, I'll move on. So the thing I don't have on this, because it just happened early this morning, is Chris updated, sent a PR with his text for the normative reference on the path parameters and form parameters. I didn't merge it already, just because it was very quick and I wanted to kind of give people a chance to think about it and comment on it, and see if there's anything else any other feelings people have on it. I guess my first thought on it is it seems okay. So also thanks to Kevin and Chris for the other review stuff. I've already merged that into the repo. So whenever after I'm done talking to the ADs about their concerns and make the updates for the shared keys, I'll do another draft. So does anybody have any comments on Chris's PR? I had a chance to look at it. I think he submitted it at like 1 a.m. my time, so I'm doubting it, but figured I'd throw it out there before I finish up.
I haven't read it yet, but I will.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I guess I'm all done then. I'll make sure to send those emails out to the mailing list so people can reply, and thank you very much.
I think the other thing is we have, I don't know if Francesca is there. We put review of URI signing on the next telechat. If we have to make these updates, is that something that we need to do ahead of that, or?
Francesca, did you have a comment?
Yes. So as soon as you posted the update, I added it to the next telechat, which is December the 2nd. So that's why I put it up directly, because otherwise it would get filled up and it would have to wait 6 weeks instead of 4 weeks. So if the working group and you, Phil, can make any additional modification, let's say at the latest, like 3-4 days before the telechat. But yeah, as soon as possible. But let's say 1 week before the telechat, that will give the ADs enough time to review like the stable version, let's say. And yeah, it might not be needed if they remove their discuss before the telechat. We don't actually need to go through, but I just wanted to put it up there so that the ADs have a deadline, and yeah, like by that time they will have to have reviewed the latest version.
Okay, so we have some open questions. Phil's going to put them out on the list. Everybody's going to respond, and we'll have that discussion. And if we can close those out over the next couple of weeks, then we can leave it on the agenda for the December telechat. If it starts dragging out, then we may need to push it out.
Yeah, and that's fine as well. Just let me know, and I will move it to the to another one. I don't know, 2 weeks later or more time if needed. But ideally, it would be good to have 1 week, or to know if we need to move it 1 week before the telechat. So November 25th or something like that, because that's when the agenda is set.
Okay, so we have 2 weeks to figure this out, Phil.
Okay, my goal is to do work on this. So you said the 25th, which is Thanksgiving. I have that week off, and so I was planning to do work on it during that week. So hopefully, I think that aligns well with what my intention was.
Okay, great. And again, if not, just let me know and I can move it. No, like no big pressure. Just just try to make it the most optimized way. But thank you for the update, Phil.
Yep, thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Phil. All right. So next we have up Frederick to talk about the HTTPS delegation. All right, Fred, you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I will give you a quick update on the draft. We are on version 7 now. Next slide, please. So in the mailing list, we had quite many comments on the draft. First, we split the document into 2 drafts, as required by the chair in the last CD9 working group session. So the first draft we are talking today is strictly about the Acme Star delegation methods, and the other part in the other document deals with subsets only. For that, we will have the help of Guillaume Bichot, that is not here today, I think.
He's
so
there.
we,
Guillaume is on. I see him.
Oh.
He's there.
Okay. So Guillaume, feel free to comment if necessary. Then we fixed a bunch of things in the draft. We changed the generic metadata name because we used wrong names in the metadata in the draft. So we corrected this. We removed the periodicity because actually we do not need this anymore. We have also registered a new FCI payload type. Actually, we need to do that once the draft is being RFC. And we added a privacy section, which needs to be, I guess, completed a bit. Next slide, please. So we have still a bunch of things to do, especially on the security and privacy parts. So Kevin, you ask quite many questions, and we still maybe have to add some hints about those. So I don't know yet. Yeah, maybe we will discuss about that later. Anyway, so regarding security and privacy, we need to study a bit how to answer that. We also need to fix some reference. Also, need to refer to the RFC 9115 instead of RFC 8739. We need to remove also the some star delegation method properties. As it is mentioned today, we have the ACME server and credentials location URI and CSR template. So these might not be necessary to carry between CDNs. However, maybe the CSR template could be in some cases needed. So this will need to be discussed still. And finally, we need also to sync maybe with SVA working group that is working on the CDNI interfaces. Notably, if we need to add some more properties in the CDNI, in the metadata interface. So that's still to be done for the next version, I guess. And I think it's next slide, please. Yeah. So yeah, if we have done all this, maybe we can ask for a last call. But yeah, I think it's done from my side.
So I sent some comments to the list this weekend. I read the updated draft. I think there's still some more work we need to do. We do need to beef up the privacy and security sections, and I still have a couple of questions about the metadata structure and whether we need the FCI payload type. But that's you can take a look at the comments I posted to the list.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I think we're a little premature for a working group last call. We can look at the next version of the draft. Hopefully we can iterate over it. And then, between now and next March, if we can get to a good place, we could probably think about that before the next IETF. But we'll see where we can get to with that. Okay.
Okay, good.
As an individual, I concur with Kevin on that. We need to wait on the working group last call on this draft because of the changes that need to be made. Specifically, the RFC 9115 does a lot of work that aligns with what this draft is trying to do. So I think there needs to be a pretty good alignment between how the interface, how the downstream CDN will establish requests with the upstream CDN to exchange information for identifying itself as the ACME client and talking to the upstream CDN as the ACME server. So I think all of that interaction has to be really captured well. So I think once we have that in the next draft, it should have a good review, and based on that we should decide how the draft moves forward. Thanks.
Anyone else have any comments on the ACP delegation? Okay. I'll look forward to seeing the updated draft. It sounds like the RFC 9115 changes could be significant. So once that update is out, everyone should go and reread and make sure it looks good to everyone. And then we can take that one to the list. All right, thanks, Fred. Up next is Glenn to talk about metadata. This is a big one. So, Glenn, take it away. Did we lose Glenn?
Hi.
Glenn, are you muted?
No, it looks like he's having some bandwidth issues. There may be technical difficulties. Glenn, are you there? Should we go to Andrew first?
By me, if no one else objects.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Andrew,
Let me pull Andrew's slides and we'll let him go first. All right, Andrew, if you're
Okay.
ready.
Sorry, yes. Hi, name's Andrew Ryan. I'm here today to discuss some potential extensions, mainly to the FCI, to allow signaling of capacity capabilities and limits. Next slide, please. So this is specifically related to the draft that is mentioned here, the draft Ryan CDNI Capacity Insights Extensions 01. Next slide, please. And so this, we discussed this topic briefly at the last IETF 111, but the general highlights of what we're trying to accomplish here and the reason we're going to be, who we've proposed this draft is, we wanted to be able to accommodate the ability to allow CDNs, upstream CDNs, downstream CDNs, or content providers, the ability to make informed decisions about how much traffic should be delegated. We wanted to provide a vehicle using CDNI, and particularly the FCI interface, to handle the signaling. And the goal was to be able to signal capacity limits that are specific to the delegation relationship between an upstream and a downstream, make sure that the signaling that's being provided is unambiguous and very clearly and mutually understood, and that there's the ability for a communication direction between the upstream and the downstream. And just a quick call out that the actual transport mechanism itself is somewhat out of scope of this. We're mainly just talking about and making the proposal about the vehicle in which the data is going to be encapsulated with. I know there's been some discussion about using Alto. The specific use case that we hear in the Streaming Video Alliance for the Open Caching Initiative was there's another API interface that we'd be leveraging, but the data model is going to rely heavily upon CDNI. Next slide, please. So how are we going to accomplish everything we've laid out there? What we've kind of come up with is that during discussion, we wanted to leverage FCI as much as possible. We felt this was very appropriate to act and be conducted as a capability, how much capacity a downstream is advertising to an upstream. So as such, we proposed, okay, let's come up with a payload that a downstream could use to advertise capacity limit capabilities. The limits would be in units such as bits per second, requests per second, and the way we were going to tackle the goal that I had mentioned about unambiguous and mutually understood limits is by coupling each one of these capacity limits with a corresponding telemetry source, which gave near real-time aggregated metrics about the usage of an upstream against a downstream. And so in that way, if the downstream says, this is a limit you can only send me 100 gigabits per second, there's no ambiguity in what that means, because the upstream can poll a telemetry source provided by the downstream to see the current delegation utilization and then adjust accordingly. The second component here, the FCI telemetry, this is kind of a result of what we just mentioned, how we want to couple a telemetry source with a capacity limit. This mechanism here, this FCI telemetry, is the ability for a downstream to advertise support for specific telemetry sources or types. Eventually, we would like to propose and work towards putting together a draft to define a formal telemetry interface in which there's a well-defined transport and a well-defined format of the data that would be available for near-time aggregated metrics, such as things like bits per second, requests per second, etc. But in lieu of that, what we're basically going to be doing in the near term, since a formal telemetry interface would be a very large effort to scope and define, we wanted to leverage in the near term just a stub of a generic telemetry source. And the goal of that is twofold. One, the level of effort in defining a formal telemetry interface and the integration. But two, it's in most cases right now, folks who are actively working on delegating requests between different entities, there already are existing telemetry sources. So being able to leverage already existing telemetry sources and all of the work that's done there, this will help ease of adoption if folks start moving towards this model. So instead of adding additional work to integrate in that telemetry, let's take advantage of work that's already been done. So those two are tightly coupled together in how the upstream and the downstream can talk about the specific limits the downstream is allowing the upstream. Or this next one, this MI capacity, requested capacity limits element, it's a generic metadata element that we're kind of using to allow a vehicle for the upstream to ask the downstream to reconsider and publish new capacity limits. So the other in the previous models, these FCI capabilities, the upstream would be polling the downstream. In this model, the upstream would be able to use this metadata object to send a signal to the downstream, which would then trigger an asynchronous process in the back end, which is left up to the downstream to implement and work out all the details on. This is mainly just a vehicle, once again, to facilitate the bidirectional communication goal that we've been looking for. Next slide, please.
Just one question. I think, Kevin, you have a question here?
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned existing sources. Are the majority of these sources proprietary in nature, or are there standard protocols, right, that people are using to currently distribute the data or emit the data?
That's a very good question. It's I guess a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, right? Typically, it's going to be some kind of an HTTPS API endpoint in which content providers or other CDNs are polling a bespoke interface provided by a downstream CDN, which has it provides metrics, and the payload is in a bespoke form. Typically it's going to be JSON or something of that nature, but there is no standardization at all there. And that's actually going back to your point. We do eventually want to go and make the proposal to define a telemetry interface. because of that exact reason. There's no standardization, there's no communication channel well defined. It's all kind of just ad hoc based on which provider is involved. So yes, that's.
But
Sorry.
we believe that the data itself is describable in a generic way because though the interfaces are proprietary, the type of information that's being provided is fairly consistent across different vendors. Or
Yes, that was kind of the decision point we were looking at, and I think one of your other feedback points was the concept of are we going to be defining a registry? And the answer to that point was yes, for specific types of telemetry, such as bits per second, requests per second. I feel there's I guess a generally well understood concept of what those generally mean. But even still, they're kind of getting back to the point of tying it to a telemetry source. There could still be some ambiguity in that, right? If the upstream is calculating bits per second in a different manner, particularly if we're looking at the use case of a content provider who may be collecting telemetry from clients directly via RUM, they may get a certain calculation of usage from that versus tracking internally from another system, server-side style metric. There was no clear way at that point to have the upstream calculate on its own its usage against the downstream without incurring some form of ambiguity as a result. Therefore, we felt that it was more appropriate for the downstream to provide a telemetry source of the usage that it is seeing based on the delegation. And in that manner, when the upstream and the downstream are using the same telemetry source to calculate or look at utilization, the ambiguity is then gone. And therefore, both parties involved are using a unified telemetry source to understand the current utilization.
got it. All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at that point? All right. So right here, what we're looking at is what we're proposing for the format of the FCI capacity limits payload type. Kevin, you had given some good feedback too, particularly about the first two bullet points, the total limits versus the host limits. The current intention up here with the way it's currently structured was that the total limits object would represent all traffic delegated between an upstream and a downstream. So if the downstream says upstream, you can delegate or you can send me 100 gigabits per second, that's ubiquitous across all CDN domains. The second section, though, was meant to allow the downstream to have some way, shape, or form to tell the upstream that certain type of traffic is different from other types of traffic. Low latency, streaming is going to have a much different request profile than general game download or other style of bulk traffic, and may have different utilization impacts on their infrastructure. So being able to tie both of these elements together to say, here's a general upstream, you can delegate all of the total traffic you can delegate is governed by this, along with if you're going to send me traffic on this host name, which we know is low latency or some other high RPS or whatever, this is how we would be able to make the differentiation such that all traffic is not created equal. It's really going to become very relevant once you get delegation relationships where an upstream could be delegating many, many, many different, content providers or CDN domains, and you're going to have a very heterogeneous blend of traffic. And being able to specifically pick out a particular subset of that traffic and identify it differently than others was once again the intention behind the host limits. But at the same time, having this total limits really cuts down on the bulk of the request, such that if we just assume the upstream has a certain profile, we'll advertise a total traffic delegation allotment, except for the stuff that's the outlier. So that's really the intention and the interaction points between these total limits and host limits payloads. Now, Kevin, like you mentioned earlier, there may be room for improvement here on simplifying the object structure by perhaps pulling the host out of the host limits and specifying it within an object type of the total limits, and just making the assumption that a lack of a host declaration assumes a total limit. We will certainly take that back for consideration and update the draft accordingly based on that feedback. Next slide, please. So this once again drew some very good chatter, or very good feedback on the list. What is the FCI telemetry here? This object here is once again made to represent capabilities of supported telemetry. So this is what is a downstream capable of supporting in terms of telemetry sources. As we can see here, there's a type generic, and this is once again a call out where what we wanted to highlight in that this is really meant to be more of a accommodation for existing telemetry sources, and also for the fact that there is no formal telemetry interface specified yet, but we wanted to future-proof it a little bit based on the fact that eventually we hope that something will come of that, and we're kind of leaving this as a placeholder here. But for the time being, this is really a way for the downstream to signal to the upstream that, hey, we support these different types of telemetry, and it's also going to provide some of the linkage between what the telemetry source supports in terms of things such as time granularity, percentile latency to near real time, etc. Any questions on this component here? All right, next slide, please. So here is a very high level workflow of what we're anticipating all of this to kind of come together with. So in this workflow here, we're really describing the upstream periodically polling the downstream. Now, the upstream has a couple different responsibilities. The upstream would be polling the downstream periodically to get what the capability or the capabilities of capacity limits from the downstream are. So that would be the top left diagram here. So the downstream will respond back with an FCI payload, which will contain the FCI capacity limits specific payload. There would be a TTL associated with that. Currently, our thought process is that we would use HTTP cache control headers to govern that TTL. That fits nicely into the framework of communication that the SVA Open Caching project is specifying. But in lieu of that, the upstream is expected to periodically poll the downstream to get what the advertised capability limits are for capacity. The upstream is then also expected to periodically poll the telemetry source that the downstream is providing to gather and understand the current utilization. That is represented by the upper right-hand component of this. Then in the bottom, the upstream is then supposed to compare its current utilization towards the advertised capacity limits that the downstream is provided, and adjust traffic routing decisions accordingly to fit within the advertised limits. Next slide, please. And here, this is a call out again to the fact that we want to be able to we want to allow the downstream to potentially signal to the upstream that a change has been made to the FCI capabilities for capacity limits. This model here was really governed, or really more specific towards the open caching, the SVA open caching workflow, such that we'd be using callback hooks to for subscriptions to SVA or the FCI capabilities updates. But the idea here is that we want there is a mechanism for the downstream to signal back to the upstream. There was a change in FCI capabilities. Come pick up your newest version of your capacity limits. The main impetus for this is that we want to assume that the limits that were provided are expected to be, valid unless you hear otherwise. There shouldn't necessarily have to be a constant polling from the upstream every 5 minutes to say, hey, has something changed? Hey, has something changed? The intention here is that the downstream would give a kind of a long-standing order of capacity limits to the upstream, which they would try to adhere to unless something changed on the downstream. There was some event, such as a massive loss of a data center, the massive loss of capacity in a site, or something to that effect, which would warrant a signal up to the upstream to say, come get your updated limits. Next slide, please. This here is once again the mechanism to allow the other side of the communication, where the upstream would want to ask the downstream to reconsider limits. Up until now, it's really been more of a one-sided conversation. It's the downstream providing data to the upstream about these are the limits we want you to adhere to. And the limits in this point are really considered like not to exceed style limits. Like, please don't go past X amount of this telemetry source described value of bits per second, requests per second, etc. But let's just say the upstream has some kind of a demand coming up that they're aware of, and they'd like to ask their various downstream partners, would you be willing to consider an update to support this? This is the vehicle that we came up with to allow to facilitate that conversation. The scoping here is really bound to how the metadata object model is set up. In this particular case, we're stating that this signal of MI requested capacity limits is bound specifically to this CDN domain of servicea.cdnexample.com. We really weren't able to come up with a clean way to allow the upstreams to just ask for generic total delegation relationship advertisement updates. Right now, the vehicle described using this metadata model is very specific to a particular host. So at the moment, we're kind of somewhat constrained in how an upstream can really ask a downstream to reconsider updates based at this level of scoping. Are there any updates on this component? Or sorry, requests, or sorry, questions about this component?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. It may not fit exactly metadata, but it's not a trigger. You use a trigger to ask them to update this piece of metadata so that you can ask for an updated limit. It's a weird kind of a flow. Something we should dig into more as to whether or not this is the best way to go about it. Or is I gather that you went this route because this was the only way you could figure to do it with the given APIs, or with the given interfaces, but it's not ideal for your use case, correct?
I would say that's an accurate case. This was kind of a middle ground we came up with, trying to adhere as closely as we can within the framework without boiling the ocean. To your
Right.
point, it wasn't necessarily a trigger. It's not necessarily a true configuration, but this was proposed by one of the co-authors, Ben, as a very clever solution, I feel, to use what we have available in order to accommodate. But like we mentioned, there are some caveats we wish we didn't necessarily have, i.e. like the scoping to a particular host in this example. But I think we would welcome feedback on this part, especially because this one was one that we feel is the least straightforward of our proposal.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Next slide, please. And once again, this just kind of goes through how we would imagine using this MI requested capacity limits object. The upstream would post that to the downstream. The downstream would then follow its already existing workflow on calculating current utilization based on a policy engine that is outside the scope of this document. The downstream would then decide whether or not it wants to update its current capacity limits, and then advertise that back up to the CDN, or the upstream CDN. Next slide, please. So that is the proposal that we're coming forth today with. like I said, we definitely welcome lots of feedback, Kevin. I thank you very much for your feedback. It was very good. We're certainly going to incorporate that in. We would certainly love more feedback as well. So please,
Yeah.
if there's any questions, please.
Yeah, if anyone wants to, I know the draft just came out before the deadline, and so I don't know if everyone's had chances to read it, but it is a good read. I encourage everyone to go and take a look. And I posted comments to the list. Please, everyone else, read and post your comments as well. There's some open questions there, some great ideas. So if other folks have thoughts, that'd be really helpful.
As a side note as well, we're in terms of this was kind of a spawn off from work being done via the Streaming Video Alliance, specifically for the Open Caching Working Group. There is kind of a partner document to this that's specific to the SVA. And we're going to hopefully have that, maybe, I'm not sure when, available for viewability as well, which would help also provide additional context on the usage and where this kind of came from as well. But once again, there's such a rich wealth of, I guess, of opportunity that's already baked into the CDNI. It just made sense to leverage that as much as possible, and we felt that signaling capacity fit extremely well within the FCI interface already. We just wanted to provide a vehicle to signal capacity via FCI, and that's really what this document or this proposal here is mainly trying to get around to.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the draft. Again, everybody go out and read the draft, please, and send comments back to Andrew.
Yeah, I second that, and I think Andrew, you covered good bit of details here, so I think that's helpful, and hopefully folks will have now a better sense of as they review the document. So yeah, please go ahead and review it and post your comments on the mailing list.
All right, thank you very much, everybody.
All right, Glenn, we're going to give this another shot.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm weirdly set up through the phone and there's an echo. I'm going to turn down the audio. Are you hearing an echo?
No, it sounds okay to me.
All right, so I'm going to kill the audio, so I won't be able to hear you guys. So I'm just going to talk.
Okay.
Okay. Good. I assume you got me now? Okay.
Yes.
So I'll start with some background here on the configuration metadata project, and then we kind of move into the current state of the draft. So go to the next slide. Yeah, background. Next slide. Perfect. Yeah, so there's just some background on why the SVA got into this. And by the way, my co-authors and contributors are on the line here, so they can chime in as well on this. But we can skip ahead. I don't think we need to focus on this much. Go ahead. Perfect. Yeah, so we started looking at CDNI metadata for this and realized that the object model needed to be extended to handle some typical use cases for commercial CDNs. And I won't get too much into the triggering and stuff, but mostly we were looking at adding extensions to define cache policies and such. So go ahead to the next slide. We're going to get right into it. So this is the CDNI metadata model that you all know and love from RFC 8006. And the important thing to note here is the extensions we proposed all live within the set of generic metadata objects. It's a new set of generic metadata objects. And we made proposed no changes at all to the structure. We've had one situation where this has been a little bit troublesome, and I'll just mention it because it came up in capacity as well. One of the metadata objects we've introduced is a service ID. And this idea that, most commercial CDNs, open caching systems have some sort of a SCID, a SKU, a CP code, a service ID. And we've set it up so that those can be metadata, but it's almost backwards. In this model, you define host names and then apply metadata to the host name. So now we can say, great, if the host name is www.video.example.com, then assign the service ID. But in fact, CDN configurations are almost usually inverted. You define a service ID and then put hosts under it. So this is a thing we may want to discuss in the future. I just bring it up because it has been a little bit of an issue for us. Next slide. This is the set of generic metadata objects that are in the RFC draft. I think there's 13 of them here in red, and each section in the draft just basically details the new generic metadata object, its reason for being, and its properties. We'll get into that. Next slide. The enhancements fall into these general categories: enhanced source origin definitions, and the main motivators there were to introduce load balancing and failover, some authentication methods to authenticate to origins. The AWS method was mentioned earlier, simple header auth. There's a lot of work done in increased cache control policies, and a lot of the motivation behind those, and I'll address some of the questions that Kevin had brought up. Yes, the origin or the content provider can specify cache control in headers coming out of the responses from the origin. But typically, we need to define caching rules not only for the end client, the user agent, but caching rules for the CDN. And they're often different parameters. You may want different internal caching rules or times in the CDN than you would want downstream. So that's the motivation for many of these cache policy extensions. There's a whole set of extensions on dynamic cores, headers. Traffic type, I'll get into that. Service IDs I mentioned. Open caching configurations as part of defining open caching request routing rules. We had the need for some metadata there, some configuration metadata, some objects went in there. Private features came up, and there were some questions Kevin had about that as well. You could keep adding private features by having more and more generic metadata objects. This is true. But we wanted to have a structure around it so that organizations like the SVA could have a registry of their own private features that would really sit internal into this one object without additional generic metadata objects. And lastly, the processing stage model, which I'll dive into deeper. Can you all hear me okay? Sanjay, want to give me a hands up?
Alfonso, you have a question here, so do you want to go?
Yeah, it's just to add about the cache control policies, dynamic core headers, all that Glenn has explained. That other of the motivations I think for this is that many CDNs act as sub-projected origins. Sub-project origins, I think is the name. It's an old draft from the IETF. So they present to the users more like an origin and not like a cache system. So they are acting as an origin from the content provider perspective. And for the user. So it's very common these use cases where the origin of a content provider of an upstream CDN doesn't want to make all the things that could be required for a user making that request, but let the sub-project origin to do that job. One example could be the dynamic core headers, where maybe they don't want to handle that in the origin, but let the CDN to do that job and to select the adequate core header to present to the user. This is the kind of motivation on some of these new generic metadata objects.
Good. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, any other comments? Yeah, so a big piece of the work that was added was this definition of processing stages, and I noted Kevin's recent comment that this may be big enough to be broken out into its own draft, and we can consider that for a next version. The idea here, though, is that metadata needs to be applied at various, really these 4 key points in the request response processing pipeline, and this structure enables us to attach metadata at these 4 points in the request response pipeline. Typically, you may, for example, have a cached response, the client response portion of it labeled D in the diagram, and you may want to adjust the response for each client as it comes out of cache. This gives you an ability to do that sort of a thing. Most processing happens generally on getting a request from the client and on processing a response from the origin. But this does give, we've seen use cases over the years that call for all 4 of these stages. Next slide, please. This is the data model that we've designed for the processing stages. This diagram, thanks to Alfonso's ASCII artwork, is now in the revision, the latest revision of the draft. Thanks, Alfonso, for that. So it defines really a new generic metadata object, which is processing stages, and it's got a set of rules, and there's rules for each of the 4 stages you saw in the previous diagram. Each rule essentially is structured as a match expression and then metadata to be applied if that match hits. This allows you to effectively conditionally do things at certain stages based on a match. On the request side, it may be a match on some pattern of the request URL or on a header. And on the response side, you might typically be matching on some element of the response or a status code. Sanjay, did you have something?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I have to keep the volume low because I get this crazy echo here. So with it, beyond the expression matching, once you do apply a rule at a certain stage, you essentially are either transforming the request, transforming the response, or generating a complete synthetic response. Those are generally kinds of things that go on. That's probably enough detail here for now. There's structures here that allow you to specify lists of headers that can be added, lists of headers that can be replaced, etc. Next slide. Good. So here's a typical full example of a processing stage, a very simple one. In this example, for edge.example.com, standard host index, we introduce a processing stage at the origin response. So dealing with responses coming out of the origin, and we are looking for a match. So here's a simple example of the metadata expression language, which I'll get into next. Basically, if response status code is a 200, then go ahead and apply some metadata. And in this example, the metadata is a cache policy that tells the CDN to cache internally for 5 seconds. So that's a very simple type of rule that one might do. Next slide. So in the original draft, we proposed that there would be this expression language, and the expression language really does 2 things. It allows to define criteria for matching, to apply rules conditionally. And it also, there are certain areas where we actually have to synthesize a response. So there's an example of one here. And in the new version of the draft, the metadata expression language is called out with the syntax for the various variables and expressions. So the first expression here is a simple expression match. That's maybe a typical thing you would do to apply metadata on, in this example, is a request coming from Safari for hostexample.com. And so you could therefore apply metadata just based on a match on a user agent or something like that. The second example is using the expression language to dynamically or to synthesize a value. So in this example, we are transforming a response that may have coming out from an origin, and we're adding a cookie. And the cookie we want to add specifically is a concatenation of the user agent string and the host name. So that's the value. And then there's the other thing, the value is expression is true. That's just a signal to the engine processing this, that value is not a string literal, that it needs to be evaluated. Next slide. Yeah. No, actually, sorry, go back. Yeah. Oh, okay, that's it. Never mind. Code capacity, we're doing well. Capabilities interface, sorry, I'm looking at 2 screens at once. So as we add new metadata and all these new capabilities, of course, FCI needs to come along for the ride. So we needed to add some FCI objects that are also called out in this document so that a downstream CDN can declare its ability to support these new metadata constructs. Next. Really out of scope for this discussion, but just to put it all in context, we also within the SVA have extended the metadata interface originally proposed in RFC 8006, and there's some SVA documents being pushed through. This was really work led by Guillaume and Alfonso, and that's we probably no need to discuss it more now, but just for reference that it's there. Okay, let's kind of move ahead here. Status of the draft. Next slide.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
About this. So the ability to publish, so CD9 metadata is a triggered poll, right? You can use triggers interface to say please repoll or invalidate this metadata. Yeah. Are there specifics to that interaction that were undesirable, or are there other things? Are you actually putting these to the working group as proposal?
Yeah, I mean, the original spec was exactly that the upstream triggers the downstream to pull metadata, and that's great. But really what we're looking at is use cases here where the upstream pushes metadata into the downstream, effectively publishing configuration metadata. That was probably one of the biggest changes we've introduced. I don't know if Guillaume, if you want to add to that.
And do you think that is the eventual goal to rev RFC 8006, or is it something that's just probably stays an add-on within SVA?
We can discuss that within SVA. Within SVA, we have a whole set of APIs that implement the suite of open caching capabilities of this is just one of many. And that API implements our metadata publishing interface, which effectively is an extension of the CDNI metadata interface. But Sanjay, I think let's talk about that within the SVA and see how much of that API we want to push in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just look to add, these changes are compatible with the trigger interface. So it is more than possible to use these extensions with the trigger interface, even if we are defining a new API for some use cases that we are implementing. This is not exclusively for that API, but use the trigger API interface.
Yeah, and we can start a discussion in the mailing list about the SVA APIs and whether we feel there would be interest in pushing those into the IETF.
Right, that would probably be something we'd have to recharter for, but it's an interesting discussion point if there's, need for that. Obviously, there's value in being able to do pushes. I'm totally down with that, and we discussed it early on, but yeah, it's an interesting thing to bring back.
Well, while we're on the subject, so the API that we've currently done, really, the big thing it adds is a push. But we're going to be looking at a next round of API work that really addresses the whole workflow around managing CDN configurations. And that's where we plan on handling versions of metadata, publishing from staging to production environment, rollbacks, lists of generic metadata objects that can be used across configurations. So all of that might be work the IETF is interested in as well.
I had one other quick comment. It's impressive that the processing stages stuff was all able to be implemented in just generic metadata. I was wondering if there was if that was done just because it was a good way to get it into the metadata interface, or if that was the preferred method, or was there also considerations for changes to the metadata interface that would make that more convenient?
Well, that was creative data modeling on my part to make it fit within the generic metadata rules, as I was told the best way to move this through IETF is not to change the structural metadata. But in fact, I think it fit pretty well. If you want to go back to that schema a few slides back, I think it worked.
Yeah, I thought, and I like the ASCII drawings too. Those were awesome. It is impressive, and I think the whole processing stages issue of, you know, where do you apply it in ingress, going to the origin, coming back, or coming out of cache. It's a useful piece that we never considered. But as long as I just really wanted to figure out, you know, is this the right way to do it, or is there a better way to do it? And if in the end we like this way, then that's even better.
I feel pretty good about it, and I think it's a nice, clean structure of organizing it with rules that are applied based on match data, and then each rule is a header or a response transform. That's pretty straightforward stuff for anybody who's worked with web server configuration. So I think it's all right.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
All right, you'll move on down to the revisions. We're almost done here. So draft status next. Yeah, so this is basically a summary of what changed from revision 0. Revision 0 was a very thin shell. Apologies for that. But now there's enough information in here to sink your teeth into. There's a couple of diagrams. There are some examples, but we have many more diagrams to put in. Really what's going on here is that within the SVA, we have a set of specifications that are being actually reviewed right now. And this particular draft is derived from an SVA spec. And so now actually, and that's going through a review process. And now we're going to face the challenge of, unfortunately, keeping an internal SVA doc in sync with this draft as they both get revved. But we will rev them together. And as we go through our review process within the SVA, we'll coordinate that with creating a revision 2 here. And that will have a lot more examples. So that each proposed new generic metadata object will have an example in there with it, which is what you want to see. And then the metadata expression language portion was added as well here. I think the next couple slides were just some answers I had put in line to some original questions Kevin had posed on revision 0. Probably no need to go through those now. I'll post, Kevin, the best thing for me to do is to post all that in the SVA, into the CD&I mailing list in response to your questions, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I'll do that for the same for your new set of questions as you develop them, or questions from anyone else on this revision. And we'll plan on a revision 2 probably in a month or two, like I said, coordinated with SVA review work that's going on the SVA version of this document. And we'll just wrap it up on the final slide. Can the CDI working group accept this version as a working group draft?
I think this draft was big. It definitely had a lot more detail than the one we saw earlier in the summer. Thank you for that. It was dense. I haven't made it all the way through completely yet. I need to give it another read myself. And I know it just came out, so I encourage everyone out there to please go and read the draft. There's a lot of cool stuff in the draft, and we should, you know, possibly divide it up into separate drafts. There's some that's more straightforward, like cache control policies. Those are probably less discussion points for those than there are for the actual expression language, right? There's a lot to parse through there. That's a pun, sorry. But I think that, you know, we could probably first see how folks react to it on the list. I'd like to give folks some time to read it because it is fairly big, but and then we can start picking and choosing and deciding, you know, how we want to pursue each of the things that's in there.
Yeah, I think it could be reasonable to break out the expression language portion and the processing stage portions in a separate draft if you think that's more manageable. I think you're right.
And if there are specific groupings of metadata, right, the cache policy ones could all go together. I don't know. Maybe
put them together in a chapter on their own. Yeah.
Yeah, and that may make things easier if you know, they have specific use cases around them. They're much easier to describe, and there's less, you know, mental context switching, as well as it's easier to digest for folks than a 60-page draft that's getting big.
I think you're right. Yeah, this is a problem in the SVA version as well. I think 13 new generic metadata objects are just listed in alphabetical order, and that's probably, in retrospect, not the best way.
Yeah, so I think that we could definitely get more velocity there if we group them and then put the use case in and make them easier to digest individually.
Good.
That's just my 2 cents.
No, I think that makes sense. That makes it easier to sort of read relevant information together, and then easier to respond that yes, this makes sense, and let's go with this draft. So I think, Glenn, that's a good idea. If there's an effort to break it down into, based on metadata, similar metadata, types, and have that draft that will stand on its own, and that may be easier.
Yeah. And I think also, just for the SVA folks on the call, I mentioned this, rather than going through the pain of maintaining two parallel docs, we may start to gut out the SVA Part 2 doc, the one that this is derived from, and just have the SVA doc start to wrap and reference this one. That may make life a lot easier. But we'll figure that out for ourselves in the SVA.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Glenn?
Sorry for the microphone mess up. Glad it worked out.
No worries. Thank you for your persistence.
It was a little daunting, but I did it.
If there's nothing else, that is the end of the agenda items we had for today. It looks like we finished a little bit early, which is great, but we had a lot of great discussions. If no one has any other comments, I think we can close the session. We'll look forward to seeing everybody again at the next IETF in March. Please go read all the drafts. Please post your comments to the list. We have follow-ups on a number of these drafts that we want to, move forward on, especially the URI signing one. But otherwise, thank you very much for attending. Sanjay, any last thoughts?
No, I think you summarized it well.
All right, everybody, thank you for your attendance, and we will see you at IETF 113. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.